Welcome to Construction Genius. If you want to extract yourself from the day-to-day operation of your business and spend more time focused on the things that you do best, then this interview is for you. My guest is James Camp. He helps people buy, build, and sell digital businesses. Now, before you turn off the podcast, business is business, right? And he knows how CEOs can extract themselves from the day-to-day and focus on what they do best. And that's why we have James on Construction Genius. So enjoy the insights that he shares. Feel free to share this with other CEOs you know would benefit from the insights that he has. And I want you to take specific note of how to value your time and focus your time on the tasks that are of the most value, because that's one of the key insights that James shares. So again, enjoy the interview. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius, and I really appreciate all the support you give the show. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. James, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thanks, Eric.
I'm really interested in exploring with you a challenge that I know a lot of construction company owners have, and that is removing themselves from their day-to-day operations. You have deep experience working with different businesses, helping folks to do that. So why is it that you think most CEOs struggle to remove themselves from the day-to-day?
Well, I think candidly, what I've noticed is that most CEOs that have a difficult time removing themselves are often founders. And so in my world a bit, it's people that sort of built a baby from scratch and had their hands in everything at first, and they slowly have difficult time removing their hands from those things. Whereas I've seen that when people buy businesses, like when PE shops buy a business and they place a GP in a role, as CEO, that CEO does not have an overly difficult time removing themselves from their business. But I think it's because if you grow something from scratch, you've sort of had your hand in everything at some point, and it's your baby. I think it's a much more emotional mindset issue than it is a mechanical logistics issue, right? And I think that sometimes people look at sort of the mindset of these things as sort of a farce and it doesn't really matter, but it really is just emotion that is connecting people, in my experience, to sort of letting go of some of that day to day.
It's interesting because that a lot of times when I'm working with CEOs, they're looking at themselves and their abilities. They rate themselves highly, and they're right in that they've built these great businesses. They look at their people, and their people may not be 100% of them. They may be 80 to 90%, and that 80 to 90% is good enough, but that still isn't good enough for them. And so that hinders them from getting out of their own way. Have you ever seen that?
Absolutely. I think that what happens often, and this is myself included, right? I've been on this side of the coin several times, where you think you've got great people, but you know that the way that you know it is better than they do. With that said, there's only one. If someone's at 80 or 90%, the only way they get to 100% is giving them a bit more autonomy, right? And giving them a little bit more control, right? Because the only way that you got to that level of sort of control was by getting your hands dirty, right? So at some point, there has to be some little bit of release and giving access to others. And that can be incredibly difficult, without question. I myself find that really difficult all the time. Candidly, I think there are little pieces of business where you have to do the unscalable, so to speak. There are sort of some things that you have to be able to have your hand on the pulse of. For me, a lot of it has to do with writing currently. As I sort of grow a business for me and I start to build audience and talking about buying and selling businesses, I find that I still need to be the sort of creative spark behind the concepts behind there that we write about in newsletters and in tweets and et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, even for that scenario, I will have to release myself of that, right? The New York Times is not writing, the editor of the New York Times does not write every single article in it, right? There's thousands and thousands.
So that's actually something interesting to think about is how do I distinguish between what is leverageable or scalable and what is not? In other words, what is it that I should first seek to release to other people?
I think that the early stuff is going to sound, and there's a big range here, right? If you got 100 FTEs versus if you've got none, right? There's a big range in this.
Yep.
With that said, I think that there's certain steps that one can take, and I'm not phenomenal at this, but I've seen a lot of people do it, and I sort of preach about it. It's hard for me to do myself even, but it's to really just start taking stock of what your days actually look like, because and like screen recording, taking notes, it sounds like sort of mundane, boring stuff, but I think that if you sort of, there's time tracking apps, there's Loom, which I use for screen recording. If I looked at everything I did in the day and I took notes about what I did and I recorded it, if at the end of the week, if I look back, I'm quite sure there are things that I could say, this is really not something that needs to be on my plate. This is eating time for me. And then I think there's another weird amorphous thing I like to do, which is to sort of figure out what I genuinely believe my time is worth. Right. And so for me, I've had years of my life where I paid myself out of debt that I raised against the company. I've had moments where I was sitting in eviction court, and I've had years that did really well. And so what I did was, and so in that experience, I had one business that we had a good exit on, that for 3 or 4 years, I paid myself $2,000 a month out of raised debt, and then lived off my savings, and really had a tough time with that. Granted, when we sold that business, pro rata, I got paid a good amount of money, right? So I went and looked back, and it was probably the biggest win in my life. I looked back and I said, what is pro rata my time worth over those years, right? Mm-hmm. So all that time I dedicated to it. So if I got paid $1 million a year on an exit, right? Now I need to say that at my peak performance 3 or 4 years ago, my time was worth $500 an hour. 40-hour work week, 52 weeks a year is $500 an hour for $1 million a year. Right. So now, and these are obviously back of the envelope numbers, but now that I go back and look at it, like I should not be spending my time on things that don't derive at least $500 an hour of revenue towards my business or towards me. So probably more top line for the business. So it's really, I think it's about taking stock of what you think your time is worth, and then sort of forward pro forma-ing that out a little bit, right? Because whatever I think my time is worth today, I guarantee you I'll think it's worth more in 3 or 4 years. And so I need to start thinking about, when I look backwards, what did I dedicate my efforts and time to? So figuring out what my time is worth, figuring out what are the things in my day that are somebody else could surely do and are worth significantly less than what my time is worth, and immediately getting those into the hands of someone that can take those off of my hands.
So I think right there is a key insight, and that is definitely something that I know changed my business, but it is something that I share with my clients consistently, is just that one idea of figuring out how much your time is worth, and then just getting rid of everything else that doesn't hit that. That is tremendous. So as I'm beginning to do this, what would you say is the first thing I need to release if I'm going to spend more time working on my business, getting myself out of the business, and allowing other people to begin to really step into those roles?
So for me, I try to look at things that I think could be mechanical, right? And so things that probably still need human intervention today, but we're probably close to getting away from it fully, right? And what are your weaknesses? But a perfect example I think of that is going through financials, like, sort of categorizing expenses, having an understanding of like what your P&L looks like, income statements, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody else should be doing that. First of all, you're probably not the best at it. Maybe you are. And when I say you, I mean an individual. Yep. But also when it comes down to it, like I can tell you that unless you have an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly complicated business, it doesn't take a rocket scientist of a bookkeeper to do your books. Now, being a true CFO, financial planning, tax planning, this is a whole different bag of tricks. But bookkeeping should be something that I think is very quickly taken off your hands, because you also want to have another set of eyes on it that looks at it and says like, no, this is what's working, this is what's not. And I think it's relatively time consuming. The other things that come in with that are sort of the classic scheduling, meetings, sort of how you distill that information from post meeting. So, emails, scheduling, and things along those lines, right? That's really sort of where I would look for it.
Should every CEO be involved in sales, regardless if they're at the beginning of their business or towards the end of their business?
So I think that towards the end of your business, that the sales can be, I think that it really depends on the size of the business that you're looking at. I sort of am a firm believer that most at scale CEOs, whether they recognize it or not, are just really high level salesmen, saleswomen, saleswomen. I think that's you're really doing very high level biz dev. You're getting people to buy into your vision. You're getting people to sort of follow you along with what you are, sort of the belief that what you're doing makes sense. And so you're selling internally and externally in that regard. With that said, the mechanics of actual sales, no, I think that one should be removed from that sooner than later. Part of the problem, you run into like a misalignment of incentives with SDRs, right? And with sales. And part of this is that if people work on a commission only basis or their upside is commission, they're incentivized to just sell as much as they can, right? Whereas like as a CEO or an owner, you sort of want the right clients to come in, not because you want to service them as well as possible. There's no interest in bringing in people that you can't service correctly, whatever your business is, construction or selling water bottles or whatever you want it to be. So I think that like that's one of the type of things that I think that if you set up some of the right processes and automations and workflows combined with an SDR, like a sales development rep, like someone hopping on the phone, I think you can get most of the real sales done. Obviously the super, super high level stuff is going to be a little bit relationship based, but the sooner you can remove yourself from it, I think eventually we'll get into this chat a little bit about like the exiting of a business. And a lot of that is going to be predicated on how removed you are from that business. So the sooner you can get yourself out of there, or the sooner you can set processes up to remove yourself from it, I think the better off you'll end up being.
Let's just explore that in terms of the exit. In your experience, what are the different flavors of exit that a CEO can pursue?
So I'll tell you, we just went through a cash only exit. And when I say cash only, someone made a joke to me the other day. They said, "Oh, did you bring duffel bags to the bank?" And what I mean by that, there was no financing, right? It was just a straight cash deal. With that said, it was not all the cash up front. So there's a couple different ways to look at this. I think that the most exits that we all see and think of are like all cash. That's how everyone perceives selling their business. They get a chunk of change, they're done. That's it. I can tell you that the smaller things I've done have been like that. A lot of the bigger things I've been involved with are not that at all, right? There are earnout agreements and clawbacks and all these different complex transactions that sort of protect both parties and allow both parties to be happy with the transaction. There's a lot of levers and pulleys you can mess with to close valuation gaps in M&A. And sort of some of those then, by doing that, you then sort of often lock yourself up in a longer transaction, which is fine. If you get what you want, but it's a little bit more involved. So we just sold a hearing aid company. We sold it to a private equity shop. When we did that, we got like 2/3 of it up front, another third of it and there was a 2-month transition, another third of it about a month later. And then the last, well, maybe not full third, but the last little chunk, which was just the inventory, will come at the very, very, very end. And we're still waiting for that specifically. But yeah, I think in general, there's cash exits. And then the other biggest exit I've had came with a certain amount of cash and then a certain amount of a stock swap, right? So we sort of swapped equity. So I became an equity holder in the company that bought us. And then a little bit of an earnout in cash, not to complicate it, and a clawback in equity, meaning that I was there for 12 months to get paid out on some of the work that I did on that transition in cash. But we were given, and this is not to complicate things, we were given all of the equity up front with a clawback provision. And that clawback provision, meaning that they were allowed to take back some of that equity if we didn't hit certain KPIs, certain key performance indicators. And the reason that we structured like that versus an earnout of equity was because with the SEC, you have different rules about selling equity blocks. And I wanted all of our equity up front. Even if we lost half of it, I wanted to hypothetically be able to sell it all at a certain date. And if it had been different, if we got half up front and the other half given a year later, then what's called a seasoning restriction, sort of the time frame in which the SEC says you have to wait to sell this, would have been an extra 12 months from the second half. So my point is, normally there's really cash options and then some sort of debt. And that debt can be seller financing, it can be debt from a bank, it can be an earnout. But those are really the two ways that are involved. And I guess the third is the magic mix, which is a share swap, a stock for stock acquisition, in which I can tell you that like being paper wealthy and being cash wealthy is two very, very, very different things. I learned that the hard way, for sure.
Yeah. How have you seen CEOs balance their desire to leave a legacy with their desire to get as much money as possible out of a business?
I think that I find it very rare that people don't have a number, right? I think that it's most of the time people have a pretty big ego. I've sort of at this point in my life where I really think about like ripping apart my ego, and legacy being a little bit about it, a little bit a part of that ego. Now, with that said, I do know someone, I don't want to say exactly who they are. They run a very big lighting company. And they were recently looking at like a $400 or $500 million private equity exit. And they decided at the last second to not sell the business. And it was mostly because they really didn't like the people buying the business. Now, granted, if you're looking at a $500 million exit in cash, you quite clearly are doing well enough already that sort of your need of money is not intense, right? And so for them, they just felt like that their legacy would not have been held intact at that price point. With that said, when you're making, low to mid 8 figures a year into your pocket, I think that you have a little bit more play with how much your ego involves your legacy, right? But if you're taking home $600K a year in SDE, sellers discretionary earnings, and someone offers you, $3.5 million for your business, that's an astronomical amount of money versus what your actual take home is every year.
Yep.
And so I think that sort of there's a number in the lower range where people are willing to sort of give up their legacy, so to speak, in terms of the buyout, is what I've seen.
So what did that guy do who didn't like the people? What did he end up doing?
So I think he ended up paying a small break fee, in terms of break fee being a fee. You sign a binding LOI, so a binding letter of intent.
Yep.
That has, if you back out of it, sort of has this option that where if you have to pay money. He still runs his business. He just bought one of the most expensive homes in Southern California. And I think that the reason that sort of you get to have that ego at that point partially is predicated on the concept of the fact that if you're looking at a business being bought for that much money, you're again, your take home every year is 8 figures, right? Like if he's the sole owner of the business, right? It's just him, right? So when you're taking home 10, 20, $30 million a year into your pockets, it's not so important, the 500 million, right? Because you can borrow against that. You can do whatever you want with that. So paid a break fee and sort of walked away from it.
So what are some of have you ever had an experience where someone wants to go down the path of selling their business? They do all the right things to remove themselves from it, get their processes dialed in, get their people dialed in. And then they reach the point where like, I decide I just don't want to sell it.
Yeah. I mean, that's an example. I've seen it in smaller examples too. Again, I've found that it's much more predicated on people that are founders of businesses and are CEOs, right? Because this is their baby. This is something that they've poured their heart and soul into. I think that you can go through sort of an identity crisis, right? Which sort of supersedes a lot of the money, right? If you're doing fine, right? Which is that I spent 15, 20 years or 10 years building this thing, 3 years building this thing, right? I've dedicated my blood, my sweat, my tears, my capital, my friends' capital, everything. And who am I when this is done, right? And often, again, it's another thing if you're getting enough money to be whoever you want when it's done. But if you're not, you start thinking like, what am I going to do next? Right? Like, what am I? And I've gone through that a couple of times in my life. Like I've had some wins and I've seen people I know that have had wins, but there's a very big difference between getting 800K or getting $4 million and getting $40 million. Right. So I think that people often back out because they recognize there's like an internal, like, who am I once this is done? What's going to happen? I lose all the control and all of my identity in my life. And what do I go build next? And some people are excited by that. I'm excited by that. Some people are totally lost by it.
Let's explore that a little bit then. So, because I think that's a huge issue, right? This idea of identity. How have you handled that yourself? You alluded to it slightly about the identity of the excitement of creating a new identity, let's say, but talk about that a little bit, James.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of this goes back to one thing I've thought about recently, which is like sort of ripping apart your ego a little bit, right? And sort of like, I've had this epiphany. I grew up in New York City where I didn't sort of follow the rules in the path, so to speak, of everyone else that I knew. And everyone else I knew went into professional services or partners at consulting firms, partners at iBank, stuff like that. And so I have, spent some of my life trying to fit into these certain identity blocks and see like, how do I relate to that sort of world? And I don't always necessarily. And so I think that part of it is like, I get a kick out of it. I enjoy having my back against the wall. I enjoy sort of figuring out what's next. I think we're only here once in my perspective. So why not sort of reinvent ourselves again and again and again? If that's something that interests you, and if not, then hold on to your business and build a legacy that you pass on to the next generation. But in general, it's I think it's just one of those things where the more you do it, the more comfortable you are with it. And it sounds cheesy, but it comes down to just being like okay with not caring what other people think about you or how other people perceive you. And that's something I struggle with pretty often myself, but I'm trying to get much better about. So any founder or CEO looking to sell their business, I think a lot of this needs to be about internally what's important for you and not like how others perceive you, if that makes sense. And that's sort of a never-ending quest, I think, for all of us about not worrying about how others perceive us, because our identity is predicated so heavily on the external stimuli and feedback we get from others. And if you can let go of that, I think you sort of put yourself in a really, really strong position of power moving forward.
What do you do to help yourself with that? Because it's essential. I think it's so important to talk about. And some of it we do unconsciously, some of it we do consciously. What do you do consciously to overcome that fear of what other people think?
I think I try and put myself, that's one thing I've been working a lot on recently, is really putting myself out there a lot and getting a lot of feedback from others, right? It's surrounding, I've recently moved to Los Angeles from New York. And part of that was I really wanted I was going through an identity shift. I had sold this business and I wanted to get much more involved in helping people buy and sell businesses. And I started thinking about like, how do I reframe exactly who I am? I'm not going to say that everyone can move 3,000 miles away, right? But I think it's important to like surround yourself with others who perceive you in the way that you want to be perceived. Like that is actually like, I know that sounds sort of ethereal, but it's like a really important function of mine. You know, like I've got a couple best friends now out in California that view me as the James that I want to be viewed as, right? And so I think that often that comes to it. I hate to be this guy, but it requires, if there are people in your life that are not giving you the feedback, they're not giving you that feedback loop that help you be who you want to be. I'm not saying to cut them out of your life, but it's like to be understanding of what you communicate with them, what you express with them. Because if you want to be a different person, if you want to have this different identity, and maybe for me, it's now the guy who's helping people buy and sell businesses, not the guy who's building businesses and selling them, right? And buying businesses and selling them, right? So that came from, when I was back in New York, I started telling people that I was doing, and I've done it, and I've done a lot of this, but that I do broker exempt M&A advisory, right? That's just me trying to sort of relate to my investment banking friends to say like, oh, I do what you do, right? But in their world, okay, they work at Goldman, or they're working at Cowen or whatever, right? And they're like, no, well, you don't have a 7, you don't have a 63, you're not really doing M&A advisory, right? And then I move out to California, where everyone makes it's the gold rush, right? Everyone makes their money in their own way, right?
Yeah, right.
And all of a sudden, and like, I come from a city where they want my W-2 and my tax returns for 4 years for an apartment. I come to California, they're like, can I see your checking account? I show them my checking account. They're like, here's your home, so, which is just so weird to me. But my point is that like, I think that I know it's tough, especially the older we get and the more ingrained in our people that we get surrounded by. But I think it's really important to surround yourself with people that sort of give you the feedback to be who you want to be. I'll tell you a very quick anecdote. A very good friend of mine got in trouble when we were in college. He was just messing around being an idiot, doing dumb things. And he got in trouble with the law. And when he got out of college, he said, Dad, I want to be a director. He spoke to his father, who was a director. And he goes, Dad, I want to be a director. And his dad goes, okay, we'll be a director. He goes, well, how do I do that? No one's going to give me a job. I'm a convicted felon. I did this dumb stuff, whatever. And his dad goes, well, tell people you're a director. He goes, but I've never directed anything. He goes, well, start telling people you're a director, and eventually someone will hire you to be a director, right? Like this is not, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about being a lawyer in which you have to pass the bar and have a license, or an investment banker where you need a series 7, right? Anything we want to do in this world, we just need to sort of like start telling people that's who we are and that's what we do. And then some of the old people in our lives are going to have an issue with that, for sure, unequivocally. But some of the new people in our lives, they're only going to know you under that context. Yeah. Right. So if you're like, hey, you know what? I sold my construction firm, like, and now I'm sort of, I don't know, I'm starting a orange farming business. I don't know, whatever you want to do. Right. Like when you tell that story to people, new people in your life, that's the only version of you they're going to know. Right. I think that at every moment you get an opportunity to sort of create this version of yourself that you want to be. And all you have to do is tell that story yourself, and then surround people that sort of give you that surround yourself with people that give you that positive feedback about it.
So I think the key insight that I'm pulling out that I really appreciate is, on the one hand, our identity is formed so much by what other people think about us. And then on the other hand, if we pick the people that we surround ourselves with, and those people view us in the way that we want to be viewed, then that can help to shape our identity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that like what's interesting, Eric, is you're like touching on all these like very, very deep and complex things that I think we all struggle with, right? Which is like who we are. And so much of it is about the external stimuli of people sort of telling us who we are. And I think that's sort of where the real happiness comes, when we just sort of figure out who we want to be and sort of unapologetically be those people.
Right.
And when you get to that point, you sort of get that sort of feedback from people in your life, right? Like, and eventually, by the way, the people from your past that have a hard time with this new identity of yours, they're going to hop on board unequivocally, 100%. I've seen it. As long as you stick to it, that's going to change for people. And the small outliers that don't, you probably don't need them around you significantly anyway, right? Like people are allowed to change and evolve and be better.
That's interesting. I really like that. So what if I'm a CEO, I've been trying really hard to remove myself from the business, but it's kind of like, the Godfather, just when I thought I was out, they drag me back in again. Right.
Sure.
So what can I do? What should I be focused on if I'm just finding myself get sucked back into the drama, sucked back into the day-to-day?
I mean, I think that one thing that I really struggle with, that I really want to impress upon people, is that I'm constantly working on, and they should work on, is really hiring and delegating, like really truly hiring and delegating. Getting pulled back into the drama is a function of either one of two things in my experience: either that you don't trust the people, or that they don't trust themselves, right? Essentially, right? And so someone needs to let go at this point. And that may be that you need to hire someone that everyone gets afraid they're going to hire people that disappear. Cool. I hope that everyone I hire is so good, excuse my language, sorry, is so good,
yeah,
that they at one point need to go somewhere else, or they do something on their own. That's fine. And the other thing is that people get really fearful when the reality is that not everyone's an entrepreneur. Not everyone wants to be a CEO. That's not the lane everyone plays in. No one, the way that I live my life, which is feast or famine. I don't get paid 6-7 months at a time. Just serving, like, we bought a business in March 2021. We sold that business. We closed and started closing the sale of that business in November. I still have not been paid $1 out of that business, right? I didn't take a salary. Everyone got a salary but me. Now, this is a little bit different than I think sort of the CEOs, right? But in general, so you have to sort of be able to let go and trust that the people that are involved can run it on their own. And be willing to maybe make a little less money from in the interim. Like, to circle back to the story I told earlier about getting paid no money and having the exit and getting all that pro rata money later on, is I'm making a decision as an equity owner in multiple ways to get paid last. Also, upon liquidation, by the way, say we sell the business. Let's say that all of a sudden I'm in bankruptcy and everything's screwed. There's a whole list of lenders and employees, and everyone gets paid before the judge says that James gets paid anything, right? Yep. So risk and reward inexplicably tied hand in hand, right? So I think that one of the things I see often is that as people try and scale businesses, is recognizing that they may need to make a little bit less money today, right, in this growth stage, so they can make more money later on.
Yes.
Right. And that's super, super, super common, which is like, okay, you make $250,000 a year. What happens if all of a sudden you hire two people for $60,000 a year? I get it. Over the next 6 months, you're going to be freaking out because now you all of a sudden are making, 1/3 or whatever. But if this means it allows your business to grow, this is net the correct decision in the long run. So
that's tremendous. That's tremendous. That willingness to take a step back, to take 3 steps forward in the future is so essential when it comes to removing yourself from the business. You mentioned delegating specifically. This is a topic that I'm fascinated in. I always like to pick people's brains. What is your process for effective delegation?
So I will tell you that I always, because my core skill set is marketing and sales, right? That's sort of really what I think that I'm really good at. Now, candidly, the first thing that I had, sort of not a mentor, but someone I wish was my mentor, like a friend of mine who's a lot more successful than me, say to him, tell me, I know your gut is to think marketing and sales, but what you really should be doing is immediately getting the things off your plate that you're bad at, right? So instead of me thinking here on like, how do I hire more salespeople and marketing people, right? Is that first step for delegation is to hire an ops person. I hate ops. I'm bad at ops, right? So if my magic, it's a kind of cheesy saying, but zone of genius. If my zone of genius is marketing and sales, yes, eventually I want to remove myself from that and find somebody else whose zone of genius is that. But if what's really tough for me is operations, and I really struggle with the organization and operations and delegation of that, then the first thing I should be doing is hiring someone who's great at operations. And then the other thing that I think about when hiring is, let's say I got a 5-person business. We're doing $1 million a year top line or something, and I want to scale to 10 million. I don't need to go hire the COO of $1 billion company. That's probably the last person I should hire. In fact, that person is probably so far removed from understanding the mechanics and actual operations of $1 million business. What I want to do is go hire someone who is being involved in a company my size and help grow it to be a $10 million company, right? So I want to find someone that understands the mechanics of how we get from 7 figures to 8 figures in business. And that may be that you're looking more for a director of operations. It might be that like you're looking to pull someone out of a bigger org that has a slightly lower title, and you're going to let them grow into that, they can become a COO for you because they're just starting as an ops director, right? And so I think that's a major, major important thing to look at.
That's interesting. Not over hiring, so to speak. What I mean by over hiring is positionally over hiring someone, but hire someone for where you want to go.
Yes, one step forward from where you want to go, right?
Yeah,
not 3 steps. The one
excellent
thing I've seen is, and this is not to slight at any of my friends, but I have a few friends that are C-suite at multi-billion-dollar companies. Yeah. I promise you that those people have absolutely zero idea of how to mechanically run those businesses. I'm really, really, really serious, right? Their chief of staff, their EAs know more about running their businesses than they do themselves, right? Yep. And so I can tell you, with my last company, I'd put someone on my board who's the COO and CFO of about a $2 billion consumer packaged goods brand. He happens to be a good friend of mine. Sort of was like, James, whatever you need, I'm happy to hop on board. Well, I immediately thought, okay, when we start going and buying businesses doing $3 million a year to $5 million a year, he's going to be really useful. I love that man. He's awesome. He is the least useful person for that in the world. He just generally does not understand the mechanics. The mechanics of a $3 to $5 million a year business are astronomically different than the mechanics of a business that do $1 billion a year. And who he's used to having, the org chart for him is astronomically different than the org chart for me. So I think it's important to like recognize, like, yes, you want to sort of hire the best, but I don't need the best. The best is not going to be, you want an operations person, the COO who needs $480K a year plus options, who's coming from a pubco, is not the one who's going to help me scale my business from 3 million to 10 million.
No, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics of delegation, so let's say you're having a delegating conversation with someone, right?
Sure.
How have you, what sort of technique or system do you use to make sure that someone knows what they're supposed to be doing?
So I'm a big fan of like project management tools, and check-ins and communication. I think what's interesting is that I come from a digital world where that is just like the norm. What I've found is that in the brick and mortar space, there's like often massive gaps for how people are actually managing teams, right? Yep. Like, and so for me, we use Slack and Asana, right? And we have basic automation set up. In the past, I just sold this business, so we don't have so much going on now, but we used to run these scrums, these like sort of morning meetings, and sort of like, I think it's about just setting process can be amorphous. I'm okay with that. In fact, trying to sort of stick to regimented routine does not always work.
Yep.
I think you need to be able to bend, but I think trying to think about structure, for me, what I often do is I try and think about if I were removed from this business, if this was somebody else's business, and they ask me, and they were like, James, what do you think? Like, what are the things I would say? What are the checks and balances I would ask for, right? So for us, we'll put everything into Asana. Everyone gets tagged in Asana, which is our project management tracking that we use. And then we use Slack for communication. Now, it does get a little gray. We do end up leaning into Google, what I call G Suite, which I guess is now Google Workspace, some of these digital functions of it. But yeah, I think there should just be some, you just need check-ins and accountability for tracking that. And there's infinite ways to do that. These days.
Excellent. So as we're wrapping up the conversation here, in terms of scaling a business, what are the things, let's say I do want to go from, let's say I'm doing $50 million a year.
Sure.
And actually, no, I'll back up. I got a client right now. They're doing, let's say 250, right?
Okay.
And they want to go to $1 billion in 5 years.
Sure.
Okay. In your experience with that kind of scale, those kinds of dollars, just what you've observed or been involved in, what do they need to focus on?
So I'll tell you, I'm gonna be really candid that there've only been around like 2 transactions that were anywhere near that size. One was about 400 million. And I can tell you the answer to that was M&A. It was not, it was acquisitions, right? It was acquiring other businesses. I think that that's really what it was. It was not about like, how do we get more output out of our sales team? It was not how do we do more of what we have? It was how do we find accretive businesses that we can bolt on that the moment we put them in become more profitable and can scale. And so even with my last bigger business I sold in 2020, like I said, that the sale of that business was partially a stock swap, right? It was partially them giving us equity in their business. So at that scale, what I've seen is like, don't get me wrong, if you have a super high growth business that is doing 250 million a year and you're already pro formaing because you're going 20 or 30% year over year, you're already seeing where you're going to be. That's a very different thing. But you've capped out at 250 million. I mean, from my experience, the answer is M&A. The answer is rolling up other businesses in your space that sort of makes sense and are accretive to you. And the seller wants out of. So that's where I've been in that regard.
So let me ask you this then. When it comes to bolting on businesses, as you look at the desire for growth and you balance it with the need to maintain culture, is that something that is tremendously important, or is it more like, well, I want to go over there and I want to do this, so we're just going to bolt this on and then figure it out later?
I think it really depends. In my experience, it depends on sort of where, like what the business is, how much culture is there, how much is FTE based, how much is in-person based. So for me, a lot of our stuff is all digital, right? So it's like the culture is a little bit different of a culture, so to speak, right? Because it's just, we're trying to keep culture alive through Zoom chats and through, and through Slack. And that's just a very different world than, I've actually only ever had my own like full office for like 4 years of my life, which is really interesting to think about. And I often tell people I've only been on a W-2 for like 2.5 months of my life. And I'm very lucky I didn't get fired from that job because I called the person who hired me and I was like, I can't do this. And they were like, I can tell, would you like to leave before you get fired? And I was like, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yes.
But in all honesty, I think that the culture fit is super important if you have a tight, cohesive culture. I think that what I often find though, is that people manage to pull things together without getting a good culture going, to be really honest with you. And so I think there's often opportunity for buyers or sellers to create culture. And often what I find is that like CEOs who are founders and are really inexplicably tied into their business, people may love them personally, but like that the structure in which culture actually functions inside that business is not necessarily one that's healthiest for everyone. It's often healthiest for certain individuals. So culture is super important. I think community is super important, but I think that it's okay to recognize that sometimes a shift in culture is not always what's wrong. I often talk about this with websites. People will talk about algorithm updates from Google. Oh, if I buy this website and Google changes algorithm, am I gonna lose my rankings in Google? Sure, you could, or you could get better rankings. I want to be candid that these are not always, things don't always go bad here, right? You may have built a business that does $20 million a year with horrible culture, right? And it may be that the people that are buying you have a much better understanding of how to integrate teams and build culture. And what I would say is that what I've realized is that sort of under the 10 million mark, you're looking at sort of search fund, 10, 20 million, maybe search funds, high net worths, very small family offices. When you're sort of looking at the larger than that, you're looking at PE shops, right? You're really looking at sort of, or like big pubcos that are doing stock swaps. And so you're probably looking at teams much, much larger than yours making that acquisition, or people that do this for a living. So culture, I think, is important to tie in, but I think it's important to recognize that small shifts in culture may be required and may be okay. It may make things better for everyone involved.
That's cool. All right. So I want to remove myself from the day-to-day. As we're wrapping up here, James, give me your top 3 things that I need to do right away to get that going.
I would figure out, step one is I would start tracking what I do, whether it's a to-do list, through a to-do list or project management tracking or screen recording certain things. I would really go through my day and maybe every 20, 30 minutes. I know it sounds crazy, but for a week or two, every 20, 30 minutes, like take stock of what you're doing.
Yes.
Right? Like really look at what you're doing. Because I think that, for example, I woke up this morning and I did 4 hours of work before I got up and did anything. I promise you, and this is just because I'm making a transition in my life as I'm starting to build a business that's predicated on my audience and helping other people, that there are things I'm doing currently that I could remove myself from very quickly. There's no way that I need to be immediately doing, every single little detail like that the crack of dawn as soon as I wake up. So I would take stock of everything that you do, write it down. Understand what it is, write down what is required to do it, and sort of the permissions that are required to do it. Right. So I'll give you a random example here. Money's a big one, right? Like I'm not going to go hire a VA, some virtual assistant to go run my finances for me. Right. Now, for the right person, I would love to grow the business I have now to a point where I'm paying someone in person to be next to me that I fully trust, right? That can have these sort of really important things in my life with them. Like the amount of like my passwords to my banking, right? Like it's tax season right now. I'm going through something where I'm like, oh my God, I'm spending so much time digging through everything for tax season. And I wish so badly that I had somebody to do that, because this is one of those mechanical things that as long as I had someone that I trusted, there's someone that for way less than, by the way, I sort of value my time at the $500 to $1,000 an hour time frame, and it's like at that range, I should not be digging through bank statements. Like that's crazy. I should not be reconciling bank statements. That is just out of control. And partially it's because the business that I have now, we just sold the hearing aid brand, that there's people that work there fully, but with this business, which is me building an audience and teaching people how to do this and trying to help people, that I didn't think about like how to build this. It just sort of fell together. So now I need to go and do this myself. So I would track everything I do, first of all. I would then find the things that I think were easily outsourceable. And when I say outsourceable, I don't even mean hiring. That step 3 is going to be another one. I mean, like things that I could find almost robotically that I don't need some full-time employee W-2 FTE to really be doing. Right. So that might be sort of scheduling. That might be sort of reconciling bank statements. It might be whatever. What is part-time outsourceable? I don't need a full, listen, I've had tons of bookkeepers and I've had a CFO and a controller and all these different things. And I can tell you that needing a CFO and a controller and a bookkeeper, most people don't need all that right now. Right. I mean, and it's over what they need. So then I would hire those things out. And then the third thing I would do is think about what are my biggest weaknesses that are not like robotically outsourceable. And for me, that's operations. Right. So for me, that means that the next step in my business is going to be to hire an ops person to make sure that sort of the people that are the contractors are still sort of in play and all keep together, and it works with what I'm doing, and I can still stay in my zone of genius, so to speak. And then as that all gets taken in, and then when I start capping myself on a marketing and sales, which is sort of what I'm really good at, is like, that's when I start replacing myself, right? That's when I start filling myself. So those are the sort of 3 steps. I would record everything I do, replace the mundane. And then in the third level, I would look at what are the complex things that I need real brain power for, that I'm willing to pay for, but that I'm bad at. Right. And like, not even that I'm just bad at, but I hate doing. And so one thing I really try and stress to people, listen, Eric, I'm all for, Marcus Aurelius, the obstacle is a way, do what is tough. I'm all for it. But I will also tell you that success, I find, comes from not thinking about life in a vacuum and thinking about life in reality. All right. And so the vacuum says, do what lean in, do what you hate. Of course, we all have to do that to an extent. But the moment you can take that off your plate is the moment that your brain sort of opens up into being able to fully go into the things that you love doing and are great at. So I think it's important for people to remove themselves, not just from things they're bad at, but from things they dislike doing, because in the reality of life, if you hate doing something, you will do it more slowly. It will be more of a chore. You will do it more poorly, even if you're good at it. So I want to be happy and do things I love. And that's what allows me to work 20-hour days, 17-hour days, is when I'm doing something that I don't realize is work. And for that to happen, I have to sort of enjoy what I'm doing. And that means removing myself from the things I hate doing. If that makes sense.
It's interesting you say that. I've been reading the book of Ecclesiastes. And one of the things, the refrains in Ecclesiastes is to enjoy your work.
Sure.
And so, that's the flip side of the obstacle is the way, is like, dude, if you're not enjoying it, find someone else to do it. You know what I mean?
100%. And I think that in the beginning, listen, I'm all for, like I said, we all have to, the obstacle is the way, right? We have to do some of these things. But my point is that when you find yourself in a scenario, and I think that, again, to touch on this, people have a really hard time, because what happens often is we get to a certain, I know what my life's burn is, right? I know what my monthly burn is. I know what money I have to make. So often when I make more money, my burn goes up. And so that means that scaling becomes more difficult because it's harder for me to take less money to hit scale. I have a friend who does coaching for executives that want to do career changes. And often what she finds is that some guy will come in or some lady will come in and she'll say, I'm 60 years old. I'm making $700,000 a year and I hate my job. And then she says, okay, well, tell me about your life. She goes, okay, well, I have 2 kids in college. I've got 1 kid in private school still. I have my lake house, my normal house, and blah, blah, blah. And Patricia, the woman, says, I'm sorry, you can't quit your job. There's nothing you can do. Right. Because they're burned, because the moment they quit their job, they're in debt. Right. And so I think it's important to recognize that when you're in a growth phase or in a potentially thinking about an exit phase, is being cognizant that it's okay to get paid more later. And that you are willing, you're probably going to get a much bigger multiple on the paid more later. The thing that is magic to me about flipping businesses, and this is, and I call it flipping just to sort of attract more people into the concept of it. It's really value-added private equity, right? Like, how do we change this business? Or in real estate, I would think about like changing a cap rate, right? And the magic is that if a business sells for a 4x, let's say a 3x price to sales, right? 3x gross revenue, just to make the numbers easy, right? For every dollar of revenue that I can bring in, I've now, on the equity piece, I've made $3, right? And I think that that's something that people have a really hard time comprehending. So it's like, as long as, and the other thing is, when you think about removing yourself, is okay, you pay yourself $300K a year, maybe, right? I bet my bottom dollar, you can hire someone for less than $300K a year to run your business if you structure this correctly.
Absolutely.
Right? So you're changing top and bottom line. So now you're like, and this gets into like add backs and sort of how P&Ls really look. And that's a much more complex sort of thing. But in general, it's like, you want to be adding, if you're looking at exiting businesses, you want to be cognizant of what is the buyer interested in. So, let's do a price to earnings, right? To make it easier, like, or a net income. If businesses are selling for 3x net income, that's much more likely, right? These days, right? But a 3x net income, or SDE, sales discretionary earnings, then for every dollar that I can add in net income, then I should be, it doesn't matter if the SDE is a little bit less, but the net income to the business, as long as the salary I'm taking is a normal salary, then I'm actually adding $3 to my net worth down the line. And I think that's important for people to remember and recognize.
That's beautiful, dude. There's so much in there. I really appreciate it. I think it's so important for people to be able to understand that to remove themselves from their business, there's multiple things that they can do across a variety of things, including modifying their burn rate so that they feel more comfortable with the process of removing themselves from the business. So I think that is a tremendous insight that people can lay hold of. James, how can people get a hold of you? And tell us a little bit more about yourself here as we're wrapping up.
Sure. So in the elevator pitch of me is I'm a marketer who is like sort of a transaction junkie, right? Like, at my core, I'm good at marketing, and I've managed to find myself playing in the M&A space again and again. I am findable. You can find me on Twitter, which is, my Twitter is Jameson Camp, or James on Camp, Twitter. And then nanoflips.com, nanoflips.com. And that's sort of my newsletter where I talk about buying and selling digital businesses and what are the mechanics and case studies in which you could actually pull levers, change the valuation of a business quickly and sell it. And so for me, when I look at businesses, I normally try and help sort of small family offices, small PE shops, high net worth individuals, because I think there's a really, really, really crazy opportunity for most people in this world today, which is like the low 7-figure and range of taking these tenets that big PE shops use in terms of value add and sort of how you reposition an asset, and applying that on a much smaller scale. And partially that's just because it's, unless you go get your MBA or unless you've worked in IB or PE, these are sort of foreign concepts that no one teaches you ever, right? But so, what I like to do these days is sort of help people find businesses that are accretive to their life or to their current business, and help them acquire it and reposition it to make their current business more profitable, and then help them catch an exit later on, hypothetically. Or very often, what I find is that I often talk about exits and flips, because again, for every dollar you add, you're getting $3 or $4 net worth. And that becomes really exciting in terms of getting people interested in these concepts. But the reality is that I find that very often people that find ways to take their business and make it more profitable, or to buy a business that they make more profitable, end up making it a buy and hold scenario, because they recognize that when you can remove yourself from the business, you can basically just be collecting dividend checks for what I would call semi-passive income. I think passive income is sort of a farce unless you're getting dividends from some giant company. Yep. But, you can remove yourself from a business and semi-passively, get a 30% cash on cash return from a business, right? Like unlevered, in a way that is just impossible in so many ways. So yeah, Jameson Camp on Twitter or nanoflips.com. That's basically all I talk about.
Beautiful. Links in the show notes for how to get hold of James. James, one last question real quick. What's the one thing you miss about New York?
Oh, so I'm going to catch some flack from this, but I miss the hustle. I miss the grind. It's pervasive in LA, but it's different. It's much more of like a slow burn. Like we're going to move and groove. Where New York, everyone is just out there trying to make it happen immediately. And that is because I was born there. That's just like deep in my soul. What I will say about New York though, is that I find that there are poets and authors who write beautiful poetry about New York, like a love poem about how enamored they are with it, how sexy it is, how beautiful it is. That is not New York to me. New York is my mom. New York is like my safety net, my comfort zone. So I like to go back to New York for a little bit of a reminder, like, let's go get it. Let's go make this happen. Right. So that's, some people hate that about New York. One man's garbage is another man's treasure. One man's trash, another man's treasure. But like New York to me is a gem for if you want to be around people that like are willing to live in a tiny home, pay obscene amounts of money to do it, and just be surrounded by 10 million other people in a tight knit space, and they all want just to be obscenely successful. New York is one of those cities that's there, and I love that.
That's awesome. And what's the one thing you like about LA?
The sun. I'm sitting here in mid-February, and it is like 75 degrees. I will probably go meditate on my roof later, and eat lunch, and that's really the quality. I will unequivocally the quality of life in Southern California beats Manhattan for sure. For sure.
That's what keeps us in Cali. It's the weather. That's for sure, man.
Unequivocally.
Awesome. James, I appreciate your time. You've been very generous, and I wish you all the best.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you again for listening to Construction Genius today. Hope you enjoyed my interview with James. Check out all of his social media links in the show notes if you'd like to get to know him a little bit better. This episode is brought to you by the Construction Conclave. The Construction Conclave is a group of construction company CEOs that meets on a monthly basis online to improve their businesses. We get together, I facilitate these discussions, I walk the conclave through a variety of the frameworks I use to help businesses with their strategy, with their sales, and with their leadership. And it's only for construction company owners. If you're interested in learning more about the conclave, please reach out to me on my website, constructiongenius.com/contact. Again, we meet just once a month for about 90 minutes, so it's not a tremendous tax on your time, but it is an opportunity for you to get together with other construction company business owners and spend some extremely focused time learning how to grow your business. So again, if the conclave is something that would be of interest to you, reach out to me on my website. And thank you for listening to Construction Genius today.